To introduce this game, we have the words of world champion Jose Capablanca. There are no doubt many people whose attention is not attracted by this game. For my part, I confess that there are few games that have so impressed me. To my mind, it is a complete masterpiece, a monument of magnificent precision. For 38 moves, the great Russian expert always played the exact move, the strongest. This game is a classic example, always to be conserved, of how chess should be played. Rubinstein opens the game here with pawn to d4. We get d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, c5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, and knight takes c3, pawn takes c3. This is the Semi-Tarrasch, and as I was developing as a chess player, the opening books that I looked at referred to this as a kind of dubious chess opening, playable, but a little bit dubious. However, in modern chess, Vladimir Kramnik has played this opening and showed that it is quite possible to play with black if you know how to combat the white center. In this game, though, black is not going to successfully combat the white center, and we'll see why it was considered such a dubious opening for such a long time. Now, we get a d4 and bishop to b4 check. This is the main line. And after bishop d2, though, we are going to see a mistake from black. Maybe the only mistake that black makes in this game. Queen to a5. This move is encouraging white to develop and force a queen trade. Now, Schlechter was considered kind of a master of the endgame, which it turns out Rubinstein would be soon considered a master of the endgame as well, and maybe he just really wanted to get the queens off the board. If so, though, he's vastly underestimated his opponent here, as Rubinstein is not going to give him another chance in this game. Once the queens come off, he's just pushing Schlechter off the board. So queen a5 on a nice developing move, attacking the bishop and encouraging bishop takes d2. And after bishop takes d2, we get queen takes d2. Of course, black doesn't want to retreat and avoid the queen trade. That would be very awkward, and white is tremendously developed and has this beautiful center. So the intention was clearly to follow through with queen takes d2. Now, I could easily see some newer players, some amateur players playing knight takes d2 here because you like to castle. You don't want to give up the right to castle and move your king early in the game. After all, even though the queens are coming off the board, we're still more in a queenless middle game than an endgame, and king safety can matter. However, here king takes d2 as played is absolutely the right move. When you have such great central control, you don't really have to worry about the safety of your king on d2. It will be super, super snug. For example, on e3, it can provide extra support to the center, and you didn't want to undevelop your knight, and there's no reason to castle in this particular game. So the king is very well placed here. Now, in this position, black castles, and I really like the next move. In some ways, I consider this the star move of the game. Bishop to b5. Now, why do I like bishop to b5 so much? In fact, Stockfish 14 even says that bishop d3 might be slightly better than bishop to b5. Well, what I love about bishop b5 is it's making it much more awkward to develop these pieces over here. For example, you can't develop a piece to d7 because there could be a trade there, and then b7 is loose. You don't want to develop the knight to c6 because then white can trade and you have weak pawns. So you're hindering development, and you're really encouraging black to go for pawn to a6 and then maybe b5. And as black is expanding on the queen side here, more squares will become weak. Now, white has an advantage without the move bishop to b5, but white doesn't really have targets. After bishop to b5, black is going to be provoked into advancing and providing the targets that will be a significant part of how white eventually wins the game. A6 is played. This does make that concession that I talked about, expanding on the queen side, but softening, for example, the b6 square. But what are you going to do instead? I don't really have better recommendations. The bishop pulls back to d3, rook to d8, rook over to c1. This rook is obviously thinking about coming in to c7. Now we get pawn to b5, and it looks like black might be gaining space, but it's really more the case that black is weakening more squares on the queen side. Rook to c7, a beautiful occupation of the 7th rank. And now ideas like knight e5 are in the air, and you're attacking f7, and very, very soon pawns could be falling. Knight to d7, that does stop knight e5. King to e3, very patient, improving the king's position. Knight f6, and maybe you're thinking about knight g4 check here, although that doesn't do too much, but knight e5 stops that. It also prepares pawn to g4, and it targets f7. So bishop d7, cutting off the attack against f7, but it's obvious that white's pieces are jumping to more and more active squares, and black's pieces are very awkward, just trying to hold things together and not make more concessions to white. g4, a beautiful move. Never underestimate the power of g4 in the endgame. It's a great way to gain space here. And obviously you're thinking about disrupting the knight by advancing further to g5. h6, stopping that g5 advance. Pawn to f4, just advancing and seizing more space. This position for white in the opening that white got a few moves ago was really, really nice, partly because these moves like g4 and f4 couldn't really be stopped by black. Like, you might look at the position out of the opening and think white's a little better, but in fact, white has such an easy path to improving the position that white is actually a lot better, and it's very hard to find a way for black to improve the position. Schlechter plays the move bishop to e8. This is just kind of shuffling. Black doesn't really know what to do, so black is going to shuffle and wait for white to try to win the game. We get g5, expanding and pushing this knight out of the f6 square. Pawn takes, the knight falls back to h7, attacking the pawn here on g5, and h4, just gaining more space and securing that pawn. Rook over to c8, and of course white just brings the rook from b1 over to c1, and we're maintaining a rook on the 7th rank. One pair of rooks leaving the board does not really provide any relief to black. Rook takes c7, rook takes c7, and rook to d8. Rook a7, and now for the first time in the game, white is starting to think about winning some material. Rook takes a6, but white is not going to be greedy, and white is going to try to continue to press the advantage that white has in terms of control of the 7th rank, activity on knight on e5 as much as possible. We can win the pawn basically whenever we want. Pawn to f6. We trade on f6. This is just opening up the rook even more. Knight back to g4, eyeing this f6 pawn, although it's defended at the moment, and also eyeing the h6 square. Bishop h5, the knight hops into h6 with check, king h8, and now there's a fork right here that's starting to tempt us. We can't go there yet because the bishop on h5 is protecting that square, so bishop to e2, improving our bishop's placement and challenging the kind of active placement of the bishop on h5. If black captures, then you're not recapturing, you're going knight f7 check and taking advantage of the fork that we just mentioned. So after bishop e2, we get bishop back to e8, more passivity that black just can't avoid, and with all the pieces on good squares, finally white cashes in and wins a pawn. Rook takes a6. King to g7, the knight falls back, knight g4, pawn to f5, rook a7 check, the rook reintroduces itself, and king back to h8. Now, knight e5, the knight goes back to its very, very strong posting. Pawn takes e4, and we don't get king takes e4 because this pawn is very vulnerable and can be picked up later. Instead, we get a nice move, bishop takes b5. Again, the point is that if you capture the bishop, bishop takes on b5, there's knight f7 check, and we have the fork picking up the rook on d8. So we've picked up both of the queenside pawns, the a6 and the b5 pawn that were weakened earlier in the game by black's advance. So after bishop takes b5, we get knight to f6, defending the pawn on e4 at least, and bishop takes e8, rook takes e8, and I love the chosen finish. King to f4. It's time for a king march to close things out. It's very difficult here for black to do anything. For example, if the knight moves, then the pawn on e4 is lost. Black is already down a pawn, and all of white's pieces are tremendously active. Maybe best here rook to g8, which is preventing the king's further invasion. But after rook g8, white can just play pawn to a4, and what is black going to do against the advance of the a pawn? Unfortunately, black can't really do anything that should win the game eventually. So after king f4, we get king over to g8 and king to g5. Beautiful shades of Nigel Short versus Jan Timman with the beautiful king invasion. rook over to f8, king to g6. And now after the king has marched into g6, we're threatening here rook to g7 check and then knight to f7, and we'd win the rook. And there's not really anything that black can do against all of these threats. The computer's saying like +8. So the game concluded here with Schlechter resigning after Rubinstein's triumphant invasion with the king all the way to g6. And I guess we could say that the game concludes with Rubinstein gaining the opposition. In fact, this victory was one of a very important string of victories in Rubinstein's career. In this tournament, San Sebastian, he won the tournament in 1912, and he won 3 other super tournaments for 4 super tournament wins in 1912. At the time, he was maybe the strongest chess player in the world, and he tried to challenge Emanuel Lasker for the world title, but he was forestalled and he never got a match. That's a tremendous tragedy because at this time, a Lasker versus Rubinstein match would have been an absolute joy to behold. Rubinstein's style in this game and in many others of the period is just natural, fluid, instructive, and joyous to behold. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. If you want to see more of my favorite chess games from the 1910s, then simply click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen.